Welcome, history students, to another episode of U.S. History Lessons with Songs. In our course, the American Civil War is a very major topic, and today's topic is a particular focus about the war. Today's topic is the North and South's views of what were the issues causing the war and their motives behind why they're acting the way they did. So this is each side's take on the great sectional controversy that led to the twin crises of national disunion and civil war. That was the issue of slavery and whether it would be allowed to expand further or not. In the heat of division over that issue, the North and South each came to see the other side and the other side's position on slavery's expansion as representing a fundamental threat to their own section's rights and liberties. Ironically, each section believed they were defending their own freedom against a tyrannical threat to it posed by the other side. So that's our main theme and topic for the day. But let's begin with some background on that key issue of disagreement. When I ask students, what caused the Civil War? The obvious answer comes up almost immediately. Slavery did. That was its root cause. And sure, that's true. But it's not so simple. After all, abolitionists, those who favored completely ending slavery, were a distinct minority even in the northern states right up until the outbreak of war. So there's got to be a more specific cause. So we're still searching on what the disagreement was on what specific political issue that the disagreement of which led to disunion. And that specific issue that had to be settled by the United States government, one way or the other, was about the expansion of slavery into the Western territories, into new territories, and therefore into new states in the Union. By 1860, Lincoln, by his election in 1860, the majority of Northerners had come to accept that slavery was an evil that should at least be contained. There should be no new states allowed into the Union with it. In a sense, slavery was to be quarantined, cooped up, kept where it already was, but not be allowed to spread and have further growth and therefore gain greater strength in the nation. Most Northerners had come to the conclusion that they favored banning slavery from the West and therefore from the nation's future. This, of course, contrasts with the Southern view that slavery was a positive good and that no limits or controls placed upon it were tolerable. Well, let's look first at the North's view of slavery and the threat they felt it represented to them. These are both Northern views. There's abolitionism, who favored immediately and everywhere ending slavery, and what's sometimes called political anti-slavery or free soilism. Let's first look at some of the underlying agreements they had, because in the most ultimate sense, they were both anti-slavery, specifically opposed to the growth of slavery. Abolitionism certainly felt that slavery was evil and tyrannical, an abominable violation of human rights. Slave owners had no respect for human rights. Therefore, the minimum beginning position is abolitionists did favor prohibiting slavery from extending into the Western territories. Now, free soilism agreed so far. Free soilers in the North also believed that slavery was evil and tyrannical, a danger and a moral wrong. And they also favored prohibiting slavery from expanding into the Western territories. Another viewpoint that both abolitionists and free soilers in the North agreed on was that slavery was harmful to the interests of most whites in society, of all the whites except for the slave owners. Abolitionists and Northern free soilers both believed that the economic prospects and opportunities for non-slave owning whites were damaged by the presence of slavery. Slavery harmed white workers is something that free soilers felt very strongly. That if wherever the institution of slavery existed, that degraded the value and the wages that labor, including free labor, could get if slavery was present as an option. And there was the idea, excuse me, that the only way to keep opportunities open for white Northerners moving westward was to keep slavery from existing in the West. So while they agreed considerably on some key points, there was also important differences between abolition and free soilism. First and foremost, perhaps, abolitionists cared deeply, maybe most, that slavery gravely harmed blacks, was so bestial and cruel to them. Whereas the majority of white free soilers did not care about blacks or what slavery did to them. In fact, if anything, most white free soilers disliked blacks. Abolitionists, most of them favored racial equality. They said it was possible whites and blacks could live together in peace and as equals with equal rights. So abolitionists tended to be pro-civil rights for blacks. Whereas white free soilers in the North almost all opposed racial equality and fiercely opposed extending rights to blacks in the North or anywhere else. Indeed, most white free soilers were racist, anti-black rights. And one of their arguments is slavery should be prohibited in the Western territories in order to keep the territories left open for settlement purely by free white laborers. Keep the blacks out of there by keeping slavery out of there. Then, of course, there was the crucial consideration that abolitionists were hell-bent on ending and abolishing slavery everywhere in the country. And of course, this did not exempt the South, since the vast majority of slaves were in the southern states. And the crucial difference, that white free soilers simply said slavery can't expand out of the South, but it may stay in the South where it already was. So, again, an overview of the important similarities, but also important differences between Northern abolitionism and Northern free soilism, or the political anti-slavery movement. So we can see that overall, in the loosest sense, both of these Northern viewpoints were anti-slavery, though with important differences. They agreed that slavery must be first and foremost prohibited from extending in the Western territories. And while abolitionists continued to be a radical minority opinion in the North, free soilism, or political anti-slavery, gradually grew into the majority political opinion of the North, as symbolized by Republican Lincoln's election in 1860. Abolition was not a majority opinion. It remained minority as of to the eve of the Civil War. But remember, abolitionists also supported the ban on slavery spreading westward. Another key idea that abolitionists really pioneered, but that white free soilers of the North adopted as well, was the idea of the evil, dangerous slave power. The slave power was a group of rich, aristocratic, haughty slave owners and Southern aristocrats who looked down on everyone else, supposedly. The slave power was evil. They showed brutality and humanity towards their slaves, but they also oppressed poor Southern whites. Slave owners, advocates of the slave power belief, argued, slave owners first and foremost tyrannized and oppressed their black slaves as property, but they also used their power to rule over all Southern whites, and indeed the South as an entire society. Non-slave owning white Southerners had almost no prospects, could not get good jobs or wages because of the slave owners' possession of slave laborers. There was a further belief that this slave power, this clique of powerful Southern slave owners, dominated the policies of the U.S. government. The slave power wished to and secretly was using the federal government to expand slavery first and foremost into the territories, but would not be content there, would eventually want to take slavery and extend their power into the North itself and everywhere throughout the country. This idea of this dangerous slave power was originated by the abolitionists, but it caught on among many non-abolitionist Northerners as well. And in the pre-Civil War decades, especially in the 1850s, Northerners began to see the long, sinister arm of the slave power behind many of the federal government's policies and behind many of the key developments of that day. Instances of where Northerners began to believe they saw the influence of the slave power was in the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, in which the federal government guaranteed the return of escaped slaves, even who had escaped into the northern states. Federal marshals would hunt to the north, apprehend these slaves, and take them back to their southern owners. Many abolitionists and other Northerners saw the slave power conspiracy behind this act. Federal slave hunters now invading the North itself and telling Northerners what they could or couldn't do with the African Americans in their midst. Another example of Northern belief that they saw the evil slave power acting was in the infamous Dred Scott case, the 1857 U.S. Supreme Court case, in which the Supreme Court ruled in an aggressively pro-slavery decision, ruled that the Constitution protected slavery everywhere in the U.S., that Dred Scott's living in a territory, Wisconsin, that's own laws forbid slavery, that he was not free because the Wisconsin anti-slavery law violated the U.S. Constitution and its guaranteed protection of people's property, including slaves. Much of the North, following the Dred Scott case, was dreading to see the next foot fall. Were Northern state laws also unconstitutional if they prohibited slavery? The Dred Scott decision led many Northerners to conclude that the slave power conspiracy was indeed in charge of the federal government and was opening everywhere in the country to slavery. So as these hot events regarding slavery and its expansion in the 1850s increased, the mutual sectional hostility and suspicion of each side towards the other grew apace. By the mid-1850s, there was in the North the creation of a new party, the so-called Republican Party. The main principles of this Republican Party of the North was free soil. They pledged to ban slavery from the Western territories. Although the Republican Party was studiously not abolitionist. They agreed that Southerners could keep their slaves in the South where they already were, but in a kind of quarantine state and not allowed to let their evil spread any further. Republicans also attracted the support of people who wanted to use government to promote moral and social reforms, such as temperance, anti-alcohol laws, and abolitionists did tend to join the Republican Party and hope to use it eventually as an instrument of abolitionism. Also, the Republican Party had a more activist government philosophy than the Democratic Party of that day. They proposed using government action to build internal improvements such as railroads and other transportation projects, support for northern industry through national tariffs, for example, and in general to support northern-style economic activity in farms and the free labor system. It was the election of that party to national office, of this new Republican Party, and its successful presidential candidate in the 1860 election, Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln and the Republicans' election in 1860 and the South's drastic response to that finally set off political disunion and civil war. Lincoln was elected president on the Republicans' free soil platform, a position to ban slavery's further extension into the territories. Southerners did not get any comfort, did not take stock in Lincoln and the Republicans' promise to not uproot or harm slavery in the southern states of the Union where slavery already existed. But Southerners didn't tend to believe him. They collapsed the abolitionist and free soil positions. There was a joke told by Southern politicians of the period, which went like this. What's the difference between a Northern abolitionist and a Northern Republican? The Northern abolitionist tells you the truth. Abolitionists made no bones. We want to end slavery. We want to free your slaves in the South. Many Southerners felt the Republicans were going to do the same. They just weren't as honest and forthright about it. So the North and South's competition for control of the U.S. government's policy and over slavery's expansion finally climaxed in the 1860 election, which the North won. If you look at this electoral results, a map of the 1860 election. This, I don't know what color it is. Shall we call it salmon on the top and on the far west coast? These are the states that went Republican, and they're essentially the northern states. And their position, of course, on slavery was it should not be allowed to expand any further. Lincoln won by carrying all of the northern states, which had larger populations and therefore a larger number of electoral votes. And Lincoln, fair and square, swept into office. The green states voted for a far southern candidate, John Breckinridge, and on the position that slavery should and would be allowed to expand into the Western territories and to future states. Lincoln won fair and square constitutionally. He was elected president by the rules of the Constitution. He had a majority in the Electoral College, and he had a 40% plurality of the popular vote. Again, Lincoln won by sweeping the northern states, even though he didn't win any of the southern states. Indeed, in the southern states, Lincoln and the Republican Party did not even qualify to get on the ballot. The North and South had utterly different takes on what the 1860 election meant and had settled. For the North, through democratic constitutional means, the new Republican Party had dethroned the slave power from its control of the federal government. The slave power tyranny had been thrown out and had lost its grip over the U.S. government. The slave power's diabolical plan to use the federal government to spread slavery everywhere and eventually into the North itself had been thwarted. The crisis was over. For the South, they had an utterly different take on what had happened in the 1860 election. For the South, the results of the 1860 election meant a tyrannical anti-Southern Northern Party had taken over the federal government. It had been elected with no Southern votes. They saw this as a purely Northern Party and presidential victory, which now ran the federal government and presumably would carry out not only its formal pledge to ban slavery from the territories, but, as Southerners tended to call them, these black Republicans, these abolitionist Republicans, are of course going to go on to swiftly end slavery in the South and all sorts of other racist nightmares, would have the blacks, our former slaves, now ruling over us and the whites and marrying our daughters and wives, etc. Because Southerners believed that banning slavery in the territories was just going to be the North's first step towards the ultimate abolitionist Republican plot. So the South didn't believe in or listen to the Republican Lincoln's promise to respect slavery in the South where it already was. Instead, Lincoln's election prompted fiery Southern so-called fire breathers in superheated rhetoric to threaten secession and to bolt from the United States, from the Union, since it was now dominated by a hostile Northern abolitionist government. The first state to do more than talk and act on this threat was South Carolina, which became the first Southern state to secede from the Union. They did so in December of 1860, still on the heels of Lincoln's recent election. In other Southern states, other so-called fire breathers or supporters of secession adopted South Carolina and even its new flag as the South's leader. When South Carolina announced they were an independent nation, had seceded, they adopted a new state flag, this one, and had a single star to symbolize they were the only state in their new nation. About a month later, after South Carolina's secession, 6 more of the deep Southern states followed South Carolina's lead and now announced a new confederacy of independent states. These were the lower South that now joined already seceded South Carolina. So this was the first or so-called Montgomery Confederacy, since their first capital was in Montgomery, Alabama. This bluish-purplish area are 4 other more upper South states that will eventually join the Confederate states as well. The full secession movement and the entire formation of these new Confederate States of America awaited the start of the war, which began in Fort Sumter, which was a federal fort in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. The newly self-styled sovereign nation of South Carolina was, of course, affronted by the presence of a U.S. federal fort in Charleston Harbor. So after several warnings for the federal forces to withdraw and vacate, when they did not, on April 12, 1861, South Carolinian forces opened fire, bombing and a rocketing attack on the U.S. fort at Fort Sumter until overwhelmed, the federal fort surrendered. And as this Charleston newspaper headline declared the next day after the firing on Fort Sumter, the Union was now dissolved, rent apart, and finally, unambiguously, it was war between the two sides. In 1861, at the war's start, it was clear what the two sides' goals and motivations were. The two sides' initial war aims were, first let's look at the Confederacies, fairly simple: national independence. They wished to have the right to preserve slavery and their other Southern rights from a U.S. government dominated by a hostile Northern tyranny, they argued. You know, I just want to comment on, especially apologists or sympathizers with the Confederacy in later time periods, including today, will say, you know, the South wasn't really fighting for slavery. They were fighting for states' rights. Well, while there's a degree of truth in that claim, which state right was it that they saw in danger and was threatened by Lincoln and the Republicans' election? It wasn't any and all states' rights. It was specifically their state right to have slavery. So, of course, it was always about slavery. The North side, the U.S. side, the continuing unions, was to save the Union, to preserve it. The Northern states, the United States, meant to defeat secessionist treason and, of course, to preserve the legal constitutional authority of the United States in the South. We can see and confirm these sides' two goals through, oh no, you guessed it, through some songs that each side sung in this time period. So we're going to look at the wartime songs of each side, sung by some of their respective troops of each side. First, we'll get the Southern take and the imagination of what they're fighting through a song. But before the Army could sing a song, of course, there had to be an army. So this is a reenactment picture of one of the first Confederate armies, the Army of so-called Northern Virginia. And the song is from the start. Actually, it's sung by Southerners from the start of the war to its end without change. So now, next I will reappear in the singing studio, and we will take a look at the song, "The Bonnie Blue Flag." This is "The Bonnie Blue Flag." We are a band of brothers and native to the soil, fighting for our liberty with treasure, blood, and toil. And when our rights were threatened, the cry rose near and far, hurrah for the bonnie blue flag that bears a single star. Hurrah, hurrah, for Southern rights, hurrah, hurrah for the bonnie blue flag that bears a single star. As long as the old Union was faithful to her trust, Like friends and like brothers, kind we were and just. But now when northern treachery attempts our rights to mar, we hoist the bonny blue flag that bears a single star. Hurrah, hurrah, for Southern rights, hurrah, hurrah for the bonny blue flag that bears a single star. And that song was The Bonny Blue Flag. And now we're back in the lecture studio, our song having been sung. So, as usual, let's now examine the lyrics of the song we just heard. And as these lyrics remind us, they talk about when our rights were threatened. This is, of course, the Southern song. When Northerners threatened our rights, then we sang, hurrah for the bonny blue flag that bears a single star. This is, of course, the flag of South Carolina. And then, of course, as the chorus makes very clear, they're all for Southern rights. That's what they're fighting for. Hurrah, hurrah for Southern rights and the bonny blue flag that bears a single star. Now, obviously, the bonny blue flag they're referring to is the first Confederate flag, when there was only one single seceded Confederate state, that of South Carolina. So other early seceding Southern states temporarily actually used South Carolina's flag, or the bonny blue flag as it was often called. Now back to the lyrics of the second verse. This is again expressing the white Southern viewpoint. You know, the old Union, they seem to be saying, was fine. Brotherly, lovely, everyone has equal rights. This is the America, the Union of the pre-1860 election, before it became an anti-slavery Northern tyranny over the South. But now, a federal reign of terror existed against slavery and, of course, all Southern rights. And Southerners were saying they will fight to get rid of this Northern federal tyranny. Never mind, of course, that what they're objecting to is the results of a legal constitutional election under the Constitution, but they, I guess, saw that differently. And then, but they say, you know, but now when Northern treachery attempts our rights to mar, we hoist the bonny blue flag that bears a single star. So that's that song. Now let's take the Union's side for a moment. And this is a visual, painting of the largest single Union army of the entire war, the Union's Army of the Potomac. And I will yet again be transported to another studio to sing the early favorite song of Union armies, and that is the song, The Battle Cry of Freedom. Okay, this is The Battle Cry of Freedom, a Union Army war song. Yes, we'll rally round the flag, boys, we'll rally round the flag, shouting the battle cry of freedom. And we'll rally from the hillside, we'll rally from the plain, shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah! Down with the traitors, up with the stars. We will rally round the flag, boys, we'll rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. We will welcome to our numbers the loyal, true, and brave, shouting the battle cry of freedom. And although he may be poor, he shall never be a slave, shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah! Down with the traitors, up with the stars. We will rally around the flag, boys, we'll rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. That was the battle cry of freedom. And now that we're back here again, let's take a look at those lyrics. So it's the battle cry of freedom. What do Northerners see themselves fighting for? To preserve American freedom, and especially the Union. The Union forever. Hurrah, boys, hurrah. Save the Union. Save it against who? Who's threatening it? Well, down with the traitors, the secessionists. So combating secession treason is what the North feels it's about. And of course, who led the South into treasonous secession? Well, of course, the big slave owners. They had led the South and the nation into this hellish pit of civil war. That evil slave power would rather destroy the Union than have slavery's progress halted. They had, Northerners believed, the Southern slave power had wanted the U.S. had wanted to use the U.S. government to permit and spread the slavery everywhere into the U.S., even into the free North. But the slave power had been defeated in election under the U.S. Constitution. But the evil slave power of the South, rather than respecting that decision, would rather rip up the Union and set the Constitution and National House on fire. Note in verse 2 that it says, "We will welcome to our numbers the loyal, true, and brave." Well, that's great. They're stressing loyalty, fidelity versus disloyal Southern secession and treason. But then it says, "And although he may be poor, he shall never be a slave." Now, let's think for a minute, what is that referring to? You might jump to the conclusion wrongly that they're talking about African Americans, former slaves, who are now fighting in the Union Army. But this song was first sung in 1861 at the outbreak of the war. The United States government had not yet issued the Emancipation Proclamation, nor was accepting African American troops into the U.S. Army. So it's not referring to them. It is referring to maybe poor, humble white Northerners, but they're not going to be treated as a slave. They're not going to let the slave power jam slavery down their throats and take it into the North. So even though they use the term slave, they're not literally talking about slaves among their number yet. So let's review the main theme of the day, which is the North and South's views and motives about what caused the war and what they were fighting for. Each side's take on the great controversy over slavery's expansion that caused the Civil War. And in the heated division over that issue, the North and South each came to see the other side and its position as representing a grave threat to their own rights and liberties. Now, their main goals and motives at the beginning were clear. We've covered these before. The South wants national independence and the ability to preserve slavery and extend it into the West. The Union, which is to preserve the Union, of course, saved the Union. By the end of the war, something important has changed. What began for the North as simply a war to save and protect the Union does morph into the South's worst fears, a war to eliminate slavery. The war will end by Union armies abolishing slavery in the South first, by the Emancipation Proclamation, and then in the whole nation by the 13th Amendment. So there is a dramatic expansion and development of Northern War aims during the course of the war. But how the goals and purposes of the war get significantly transformed is not today's topic, but that of another day, an important theme to be developed through readings and other parts of our course. So reminding us that both the North and South came to see each other as a grave threat to their own liberties is the theme of today. So for now, I leave you as always, wishing you a very good day and good history.